Wells was arguably one of the best advocates for women's rights and African American rights. She was born on July 16, 1862, as a slave in Holly Springs, Mississippi, to Jim and Elizabeth Wells. The summer she was born was a time of great change, as it was the second summer of the Civil War. The outcomes of the war would deeply change our nation and its functioning, as the Wells' dreams would quickly turn to life. All would, however, change as tragedy struck when Holly Springs would receive an epidemic of yellow fever, killing 3/4 of the town and Jim and Elizabeth Wells with it. She would care for her 5 younger siblings at the age of 16 for a year before they would all part ways. She would then move to Woodstock, Tennessee for a job in the Memphis school system, becoming a writer only when she was asked to write about the incident when she had been sent directly to the smoker's cart of the train when she had paid for first class. She then composed a thought-provoking yet stunning article describing what a struggle it was to be an African-American citizen in the States. Ida B. Wells and her future career as a teacher, writer, and activist would influence the lives all across the country.
Ida Bell was one of the most important advocates for anti-lynching. Her research was most likely the most important at the time. However, the Tuskegee Institute proved that over the course of the years 1882 to 1968, 3,446 African American men, women, and even children were lynched. And of that number, 73% of all the occurrences had all occurred in the South, where Ida's work was used and needed the most. Ida would have the lives of one of her dearest friends, Thomas Moss, taken. He had been killed by a mob with his 2 other friends as they had shot white men for trying to raid their store. The men were found to recover. However, for the town, it was not enough, as the young men were carried in front of a crowd and lynched publicly. Wells became the owner of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, explaining the deep issues that circled around America. Ida dedicated most of her life to the anti-lynching movement, writing pamphlets that would become world-renowned to identify realistic horrors that occurred as citizens were being killed. She would tabulate all her statistics in the Red Record, finding that from the time of 1882 to 1968, more citizens were put to death by mobs than by form of law. The Ku Klux Klan was a main antagonizer, as they would take citizens out of their homes in the middle of the night, lynching them in front of thousands. The situation was outrageous, and more blood was to be spilled, as lynching was only to be made illegal in 1968.
19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, lynching was literally murder at the hands of a mob, which was very violent. People were dragged out of their homes in the middle of the night and literally burned alive. It was just unbelievably brutal what people were doing. And it got so bold that it started to become almost like a carnival kind of sort of activities where like literally 10,000 people would show up in the middle of the day to watch somebody literally get killed. And so it was so brutal and so outrageous and absolute lawlessness that what my great-grandmother did was start investigating what kind of crimes that these people were being accused of. And a lot of times they were being accused of violating white women. And she knew, as a result of the 3 of her friends who were lynched, that the accusation of that kind of a crime was not true in a lot of the cases. So she started investigating more cases to find out exactly what was going on.
Ida B. Wells was also a crucial part in the suffrage movement for African American women. African American women were denied access at many suffrage organizations. Many women, especially Southerners, felt that having other races would illegitimize their cause. Ida and many other women wanted no part in organizations that would not have them because of their race. The battle of African American suffrage was a difficult battle, but one Ida felt could be won. Wells created the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first African American suffrage movement in the country. She realized that many women didn't have the means or education to take part in politics. This set a goal to engage more women internationally to get more involved in politics. Ida took part in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1884. She worked alongside iconic suffrage leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In March of 1913, Ida flew out to Washington, D.C. for a suffrage parade. Ida was told to go march in the back, separate from the white women. She refused to march in the back and said that she would either march at the front or not march at all. For the march, despite what some said, Ida B. Wells Barnett marched to the front with all the white women by her side. Ida's work in suffrage influenced people globally, but a lot of her work impacted Illinois. She helped establish partial suffrage, or when one can vote in municipal and presidential elections, for women over 21. Her efforts eventually paid off as the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, exactly 100 years from now. Ida would continue the fight for equality, speaking all over the United States, including speaking out and raising support in England, where the Queen would sympathize with lynching, and together they would discuss the unjust and horrid events that occurred in the States. Demonstrations would occur all over England in major cities after her road trip, and if many people in the U.S. would not accept the fact that it occurred was unjust, many still would, as Ida would came to realize that she would not accomplish much alone. She started speaking with Frederick Douglass and Thomas Fortune at press meetings, acting as each other's mentors and editors, where they would denounce the hate that humans all over America treated each other with. She soon started demanding equal rights with the ERL, where leaders such as Mary Church Terrell, who was the first owner of a color woman's newspaper which she set up in Canada, and Harriet Tubman, who had led more than 300 slaves to freedom, never losing one passenger on her railroad.
Ida's work would be needed once more, as in Lane, Arkansas, or the less equality-accepting South, a peaceful protestation had turned into a horrible manslaughter. 250 blacks all had their lives taken, and the remaining living protesters were all given lifelong jail sentences. Wells's "There is no justice here" statement seemed to be looming larger than ever.
Ida would go down to Elaine, Arkansas, and carefully assess each situation, and within 6 months, she had released the Arkansas Race Riot, or a 42-page, carefully written pamphlet describing the riot and what had occurred. After more protests from all around, the men were released, and Ida had won yet another unexpected victory. In 1920, exactly 100 years from now, the 19th Amendment was passed, stating that all women had the right to vote and run for governmental positions. Ida would soon advocate herself for the Illinois government, receiving a surprising third for the Republican Senate. Feeling that more help could be used, Ida quickly bought a community center in Chicago where prisoners, young women, homeless, and more could all stay the night and receive food and help. Ida would marry Ferdinand L. Burnett, and together they would have 6 children, and he was always active in political matters and would constantly go to late-night meetings and more. Throughout history, most people think of major white figures of the suffrage movement, explains Professor Victoria W. Walcott in an interview. Women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are currently considered the mothers of the suffrage movement, as their faces, other whites have been all over pictures, paintings, articles, news, and more. Professor Walcott explains how white women dominated suffrage organizations and often included black women, and even argued that the white women of our nation needed the vote to offset the votes of the black and immigrant men. Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, and Sojourner Truth are currently among the few women that have recognized their work in the black suffrage movement, as many have been forgotten in time. Racism has evolved in all centuries, from the 17th and 19th century slavery to the 20th century separate but equal laws, leading into most likely the worst of them, in all embarrassment to admit that what really occurred in our nation. The story continues as all around the globe, people refuse to stand up for what is right and to break barriers. Professor Victoria Walcott explains how Ida B. Wells used journalism and skillful writing to combat some of the major racist policies of her period. Her activism demonstrates the power of journalism and the power of using your voice, even for controversial issues. We live in the legacy of slavery and segregation today, so it's our responsibility as American citizens to grapple with its honest way.
On March 25th, 1931, Ida Belle Wells Barnett would die of urine poisoning at age 67. However, her legacy still lives on, as she has been recognized all over the United States with street signs, statues, paintings, and more. Michelle Duster takes the burden upon herself as the great-grandchild of Ida to preserve her legacy. She was a fighter for the helpless, a dreamer for the hopeless, a speaker for the speechless. Ida crusaded for justice.